So government teachers are very highly paid. Half of them don't show up for work. So Charlie Munger had said something that you show me an incentive and I'll show you an outcome. And again, this is a well-known story. One UP peon, there were 368 jobs, 2.3 million applications with 250 people who had a PhD.
Showing that even in a fast-growing state like Tamil Nadu that has a lot of industrial jobs, 80% of all unemployment of educated youth is estimated to be because they are writing government exam after government exam after government exam. 80%. Okay. So if you look at therefore the opportunity cost in terms of lost time, it's often thousands of man years or person years for every person who is hired. Okay. Then there's another perverse problem. The bigger perverse problem is
Welcome to the podcast, Kartik. I'm so delighted you could spare time. I know you are zipping around the country and the world quite a lot. You just said, what was it, Chennai, Mumbai, Delhi, San Diego?
No, thanks, Monica. I think I've been a fan of your writings for a long time and I'm thrilled that you're doing this podcast. So it's a pleasure to be here.
What I heard is that there is a state capacity problem. There's a capacity that the state is not able to deliver. And then when I was reading your book, there was a chapter where I saw the stats of teacher participation. So the government teachers in India are highly paid. How highly paid? Please do tell us. People find it difficult to believe. When I quote stats from your book, people look at me in disbelief, but that is hard data. So government teachers are very highly paid. Half of them don't show up for work. Is the data that I saw in your book, like 25%.
25% are absent and about 25%
are not
in school
working.
Are not teaching.
So they're not teaching. You have other benefits that the government gives. What is this? How do you solve for this moral failure of taking taxpayers' money as high salaries but not working? And this is the same story in government hospitals. The best equipment is there. It's locked up. It's not being used. So as a taxpayer, and there are very few of us, unfortunately, in this country who pay these income taxes, we feel that this is our money going in. And where is it going into? A black hole? And that really leads to all sort of other complications of the arbitrage in the wages leads to all sorts of second order impact in terms of graft, in terms of the kind of people who are hired as political beneficiaries. Just tell us what is going on here.
Yeah. No, thanks, Monica. And this is really one of these complex issues that I think, like you said, most people in kind of policy making or urban elites kind of live in such a completely disconnected bubble. This fact, one of the ways 20 years ago, so I started 25 years ago, my first PhD study was doing a nationwide study across 3,000 schools in 20 states. That's when we did these surprise visits of measuring teacher absence and doctor absence, right? So I have spent kind of days and weeks in different states, kind of, going from village to village, and you go and see, right? And then the reality hits you about these governance issues. And I was just so happy recently to see, the guys who did Panchayat now doing Gram Chikitsalaya, right? So now, because you see, this is common that you have this PHC, but the medical officer has not shown up, and that's kind of the reality, right? And so now, before we start painting everyone with a bad brush, okay, so I think with 25% absence, remember 75% of teachers are still showing up, okay, so it's not the case that people are all kind of not working, right? But again, you often have good people, but in a weak system, right? And so the system, right, what are the systemic weaknesses? The systemic weaknesses are just that, you haven't invested enough in kind of the measurement, the management, the monitoring, right? And so the other challenge in terms of why you have such high absence, and this goes back to kind of having the right staffing model, okay? So one reason you have absences, so because the teacher salaries are so high, and we'll come back to why are these salaries so high. See, the reason the salaries are so high is we have taken an approach to public sector recruitment that says you want highly qualified people and you will have this highly competitive exam, okay? So what happens is that most of the people who get selected tend to either be from urban areas or have aspirations to live in urban areas, because when you're paid that much, you don't want to live in the village because all of your kids are in private school, right? So a big reason why you have the absence is most teachers in many parts of India don't live anywhere close to the communities, and then they're traveling up and down. So even if they want to come, some days the bus will not come or something will happen or whatever. whatever, but they're not connected to the community, right? So, which is why it's less again of a teacher problem and more of a system design problem, right? And so, whereas if you look at study after study after study, what you'll see is, at least for primary education, that hiring from the local community, even at a much lower salary, even if you're not formally qualified, is often as effective, if not more effective. And that's because you're there, you're connected, you're accountable, right? So a lot of this again goes back to governance and system. So I think the absence work has kind of, it's shed light on this problem. I think the fact that you're now having TV shows talking about it, like, hopefully makes it more politically salient. I do think multiple politicians I've talked to want to act on this, but again, it's difficult, and that goes back to the political incentives, right? The political incentives, the problem is that there's a well-known idea in political economy of what's called concentrated costs and diffuse benefits, okay? And this is a way to make sense of why so many perverse things happen in the world, okay? Which is essentially, and the same story is true for farm subsidies, and we can look at this analogy everywhere, right? Which is, if the teachers were to show up and everybody were to benefit, the amount of benefit to every parent is small, okay? But if you try to take the action, the lobby is so strong that even if 2% of votes shift, that can be the difference between winning and losing. And because we have this very non-linear relationship between seats and votes, right? So a party can have a vote share difference in 2%, and that can be the difference between a majority and a minority. So which means that no politician wants to take panga, with any group of people, who are concentrated and a strong interest group. So which means that the payoff is much lower. So the risk of taking action is much higher, right? So now, of course, you're getting strong chief ministers who want to do it, but it's a constant struggle, because the way even the better chief ministers are acting is with a little bit of more pressure rather than kind of building better systems, right? Because building a system takes much longer. Now, people are trying, but I think the long-term answer to the problem of staff accountability, frankly, has to be a lot more decentralization, because in the end, it's the community that is the ultimate stakeholder, right? See, the problem today, and we can come back and talk about and that's why everything is connected, right? So a key governance challenge for us is that India is one of the most over-centralized countries in the world, okay? So which is, all of these government employees who are not showing up, they are all state government employees, correct? So even if the community knows that the teacher is not coming up, the community is absolutely powerless, right? So then you have to rely on some long chain of accountability, and because they are understaffed and overworked, it just becomes very, very difficult, right? Now, there are good historical reasons for why we did recruitment through civil service, because there was a sense that if you give the community control, there'll be corruption in who they will hire, because the sarpanch will go hire his cousin or nephew or whatever, right? So how do you balance this? So one of the ideas I talk about is saying, let's continue to have a competitive exam so that you set high standards, but passing that exam doesn't guarantee you a job. Passing the exam makes you eligible for a job, okay? And then once you're empaneled as somebody who's passed the exam, then the job is controlled by the community, right? So it's a community level job, and if you don't show up, you can be fired. But the community can't appoint any kind of mama ka rishta, because you need to be on that empaneled list, okay? So that's why you need to be creative and nuanced, and it's a use. Actually, let me give you a bit of history here, right? See, when you think about why India is so over-centralized, it's not that people were dumb, okay? There were very good historical reasons. And so India is over-centralized politically, for political reasons, economic reasons, and social reasons, right? So first, let me just give you the facts, okay? So one measure of how over-centralized we are is if you look at how much of total public spending happens at the local government level. The average across many large countries is about 25%, okay? Now, China, which is the only comparable large country that we think of as the strong centralized country, has over 50% of total spending in China happens at the local government level. In India, that number is 3%, okay? Maharashtra is the one state that does better, but once you take Maharashtra out, it's about 3%, okay? So, and we are the most over-centralized. That means the communities have no power, okay? Now, but why is this? The reason, it goes back to the historical fact that the framers of the constitution were also concerned that because local elites were so entrenched, that you had a combination of feudalism, of patriarchy, of caste hierarchies, that people like Dr. Ambedkar were convinced that the local elites would never allow marginalized to even exercise their rights or get educated, right? So the idea of a powerful centralized bureaucracy was to have a modernizing state that can act as a counter to a feudalistic and patriarchal society, right? So that's why we centralize so much. But that had its purpose, but now it's kind of become counterproductive, because now you do have 70-80% literacy rates, right? Like, I mean, compared to 15%, but the communities are still completely disempowered, right? So which is why you need to keep these historical reasons in mind in terms of designing a solution. You can't just say decentralize kar do, because even today, again, Panchayat shows this beautifully, right? You have the woman is on paper the sarpanch, but it's her husband who's running the show. But you see in that last episode in season 1, when that collector comes, okay, then everybody, they have to at least empower her a bit, right? So that's a great metaphor for this constant struggle between the modernizing state against a patriarchal and feudal society, right? So that's kind of why we centralize. Same with NREGA implementation, right? So if you had to rely purely on local officials to implement NREGA, local elite landlords would never allow it to happen, because the wages would go up, right? So again, that's why you need a combination of top-down committed bureaucracy and bottom-up interventions like social audits that allow these programs to work, okay? So similarly, when you then think about how do you solve the accountability problem, it's a combination of top-down and bottom-up, right? You can't just say, I'm going to put biometrics everywhere, because that is also the reason this is such a difficult problem is that, see, I'm a professor, right? So I don't want to do anything to teachers that I don't want done to myself as a professor, okay? So in professional areas, if you go and try to micromanage, that is also connoting an incredible lack of trust, and that is also counterproductive, right? So what you need is, I think one of the first education secretaries I worked with in AP, Dr. Subbarao, like, he once told me, he said, worker motivation is all about a combination of bhayam and bhakti, okay? So, which is you need a certain amount of accountability, a certain amount of intrinsic motivation. And so these are complex design challenges, but the way you solve that is not by kind of saying, okay, silver bullet, kal biometric kar denge, sab aa jayenge, sabko tight kar denge. Or you say, nahin, pura community ke de do, right? It is always a combination, and you need these nuanced approaches to the reforms, but those are the conversations we need to be having.
Right. And a system of measuring outcome rather than tick boxing the process, that is what actually implementation today is. We are not mapping the outcomes of, say, metrics of education or health. We are mapping the process. There's form filling happening apparently at a very large scale, but the outcomes are dysfunctional.
Exactly. And so which is why I think the whole approach to kind of strengthening systems for me starts with better data, right? It starts with, because in any system, what you measure is what you get, okay? So today you measure kitne school banaye, kitne, like, I mean, how many uniforms are distributed, like, and everything is about schemes and distribution. So you're just focusing on the inputs, right? But the outcome data is A, unreliable, and B, when it comes once in 5 years, right? So the foundation for better management is better measurement, okay? So let me give you another positive example, okay? So positive example in this is, see, the problem in public sector staffing is at one level you have too few people, okay? So we'll come back to that. The other reason we don't deliver well is we are actually very, very understaffed, okay? So it's not just a question of accountability. That is a problem at every level. You don't have enough people. The ones who you have are not posted in the right places, because everybody wants to be posted in the urban areas. Then conditional on posting, there is an absence problem, right? So it's at every level you have a problem, right? Staffing, allocation, and then attendance and effort, okay? So but here is kind of a very good example where in Telangana, like, the former chief minister, he instinctively understood that you needed more staff for frontline delivery, okay? But he also knew that you needed accountability. So he did this very unique kind of pilot where they appointed 10,000 junior panchayat secretaries, but they appointed them based on an exam, but on a 3-year contract. And they said, you will only be regularized after we assess your performance, okay? So that gave you this window of really motivating people to work. And then what my team did, like, CGIS, which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, is because obviously we can't do anything unless there's political demand. But when there's political demand, we're able to provide the technical support into how do you do the measurement and management, okay? And so the one, of course, we weren't able to do a randomized control trial, but one measure of success here is that Telangana in that period has only 5% of the panchayats in the country, but won over 40% of the national awards for Panchayati Raj, right? And so, and they won, I think, 8 out of 9 categories. They had the best kind of, and this was, the rating was given by a government, central government, governed by a different party, okay? So obviously this is credible, right? Like, kisi dusre party ke government ne bola hai ki your performance is so good. But that's again, that what drove that really, like, was you needed staffing, you need the staff, but you also need them to be accountable, right? So these are then the examples of kind of politicians kind of instinctively get it, right? But just like that car driver, he knows, okay, like, if the systems in the car were better, it would do, but he doesn't know how to build those systems, right? So instinctively they get it, and that's kind of why I'm optimistic.
Yeah, he's too busy driving to fix the car. So Charlie Munger had said something that you show me an incentive and I'll show you an outcome. And again, this is a well-known story. One UP peon, there were 368 jobs, 2.3 million applications with 250 people who had a PhD. And again, it comes back to the salaries, which are very high, the low expectation of work, and there's rent seeking actively on the side. Okay, so all of these are problems of an entrenched government employee pipeline. Like you just said, the politician is wary. A 2% swing will change the person in power. So they're very wary of tinkering with any benefit which is already on the ground. We are seeing the U-turn on the NPS to the UPS now. How do you solve this problem of this? Largely, I hate to use the word, but dysfunctional, overpaid, underworked, lower-level government employees. And the reverse may be true for the
at the
top, who are extremely skilled, overworked, underpaid according to what we just look at the banking salaries.
Absolutely.
What the State Bank of India chairperson earns versus what a private sector bank chairperson earns. I mean, it's an exponential difference. How do you solve this pyramid problem where the bottom is bloated, dysfunctional, and the top is just like trying to drive, but it doesn't have the power, it doesn't have the thrust?
Yeah, no, I think, see, this is, again, you've hit on what I think is the central problem, okay, for state capacity, right, which is the wage compression in the public sector, right? So exactly like you said, the top 1 or 2% of people who are taking decisions that are way more complex than most CEOs take, right, are massively underpaid relative to what the market would pay for those skills. But for 95% of government jobs, you're paying 5 times more than what the market pays, okay? So and this is true for teachers, this is true for all kind of non-technical skilled government workers, okay? And so there are 3 levels at which we've got to, there's different problems at different levels, right? There's a problem at the frontline level, there's a different problem at the managerial level, and there's a different problem at the top level, okay? So let's look at the frontline first, okay? So at the frontline, the problem of kind of government salaries being so high, right? Everybody, there's this notion that, oh, I need to pay well to attract good people. What I think people don't understand is how the high government salaries create so many perversities in the entire economy, right? So the first is that this is why you don't hire enough, because all the money goes in paying the few existing people that you don't have money to hire, okay? So Econ 101 will say that I need to pay less and hire more, okay? So you keep that same budget, but I can deliver much more. And we've got study after study after study showing this, right? So just to give you 2 examples, okay, from my own work in Tamil Nadu, where, one simple intervention we did was putting an extra worker in the Anganwadis, focused on early childhood education. And the stipend paid was about 4,000 to 5,000 rupees a month, okay, that's all, compared to a regular salary of 50,000. But we still found dramatic positive improvements in learning outcomes and reduction in malnutrition. And we estimate that the long-term ROI of doing this is about 2,000%. It's a 20x ROI, okay? So you're a private sector markets person. If I told you have a true 20x ROI, you'd be like, how do I put as much money to work? But we're not spending. Why? Because where does the money go? The money goes into unconditional salary increases of existing workers, okay? And that, the research shows, has 0 impact. So I have another paper called Double for Nothing, right, where you showed that an unconditional doubling of pay of existing workers has absolutely no impact, okay? So problem number 1 is that's why you don't hire enough, okay? So you need to pay less, hire more, okay? But I'll come back to, you can't pay less, okay? So how do you solve that? So I'll come to that. The second problem is that because therefore this job is so lucrative that you get like 100x the number of jobs as the applicants, right? So running the recruitment itself becomes so difficult that instead of having an orderly annual recruitment process, that you run it once in 3, 4, 5 years, and because recruitment scandals are everywhere, Bihar and Jharkhand, there was a piece, they're not able to run recruitment exams, even with like military grade security, because the stakes of the paper leak is so high, koi na koi to kahin leak kara dega, right? Which means that you paralyze your system, by paying so much above the market, because you can't run the recruitment, okay? Now, the third problem, and this is a deeper problem, because the stakes of the government job lottery are so high, okay, you have essentially people taking every possible exam, okay? So there's well-known stories of people saying, I will apply for forest guard, I'll apply for teacher, I'll apply for peon, jo bhi mil jayega, jahan lag jayega, right? So, but what that means is the person who gets selected often has no interest in that sector, has no interest in that job, because they have just applied for every possible lottery, okay? The fourth problem is this is actually one of the biggest sources of unemployment in India, and we don't appreciate this enough. So there's another recent study, like in Tamil Nadu, showing that even in a fast growing state like Tamil Nadu that has a lot of industrial jobs, 80% of all unemployment of educated youth is estimated to be because they're writing government exam after government exam after government exam. 80%. Okay. So if you look at, therefore, the opportunity cost in terms of lost time, it's often thousands of man years or person years for every person who is hired. Okay. Then there's another perverse problem. The bigger perverse problem is that this is also why we don't have skills, because the candidates are not interested in skills. They would rather take the government job lottery. So why do you have an education system? See, the tail that wags the dog of the education system is the job market. Okay, so why do I have an education system that produces lakhs of graduates with no skills? So every year you say companies are saying, I can't find skilled people, and here you've got educated graduates who are not skilled. So why are they not skilled? And that's because the most lucrative employer in the economy doesn't care about skills. The most lucrative employer only cares about passing exams. So you built an entire education system ke rata maar ke kahin na kahin jugaad karke wo exam pass ho jaye, right? But that means that people drop out of skilling programs, because who wants to do the hard work of kind of having the skills and actually be accountable? So when people look at the application ratio to government jobs and they say, oh, this means private sector is not creating enough jobs, that's completely wrong. The private sector creates jobs, but the private sector creates jobs at market wages. Okay, the problem is not that the private sector doesn't create jobs. The problem is that the public sector is so out of whack with market realities that it's completely rational for the individual to do that, but at a system level, it's incredibly dysfunctional. Okay, so but this is one of these deep issues that very few people actually pay attention to, because it's difficult to understand and do the research. Okay, but once you've documented this, how do you solve it? Okay, so there are at least 2 or 3 ways in which you can meaningfully move the needle. Okay, so the first is, if you look at which are the 3 biggest sectors where the government hires, it's teachers, nurses, and police. Okay, so the 3 biggest frontline service areas. Okay, so one simple reform idea I talked about, which many people agree makes sense, but we just have to coordinate, make it happen. Okay, is to say, let's reimagine the process of training, okay, and recruitment, so that instead of just saying I'm going to get any degree and take this exam, that you start creating practicum based credentials, okay, over a 4-year period. Imagine after 12th standard, like you finish 12th, you join a practicum based nurse training program or a practicum based teacher training program, where you get 3 months of theory and 9 months of practice, okay, where you are doing a practical training, okay, that is in the school, in the facility, or potentially you get a diploma or a degree in public safety, and then you're doing the same thing potentially in a police station. Okay, now the key point is that at the end of these 4 years, what you say is, for regular government recruitment, you will start giving extra points for people who have actually worked in that sector. Okay, so now instead of a generic lottery where you say I will apply for every possible job, you're actually rewarding people who have shown interest in that area and built the practical skills of doing that. Okay, so then what this does is, I'll give you, just to give you how much research is tied into this idea, right? So we have, like I said, a lot of strong evidence that hiring local staff is effective. But the contract teacher model failed. Okay, so governments in the 2000s, under expanding education, they tried to hire these contract teachers. Okay, but the reason contract teachers failed is it failed for 3 reasons. It failed for ideological reasons, for political reasons, for judicial reasons. Okay, so ideologically, the teacher training institutes hated the idea that you could have untrained, unqualified teachers. So NCRT, NUPA, your apex kind of national organization for education absolutely detested, okay, the idea of contract teachers. Okay, the second problem was judicial, because you're sitting side by side doing the same job. Once you have enough people, they'll go to courts and say equal pay for equal work, and then the court will say you have to regularize, and then you basically lost the benefit. The third is political. So every time before elections, you are under massive pressure to announce कि हम regularize कर देंगे, ठीक है? So which is why, even though there are some elements of the contract teacher model that worked, in practice it didn't work. Okay, so what I'm doing with this new approach is to say, let us solve all 3 of these problems. Okay, so you are actually, the professional should be very, very happy, because you will be improving the quality of training. Okay, because if you look at global evidence on what are the problem today is in teacher training, just to get you just in the weeds of one example, right? If you look at the research, our entire education policy says we must hire only qualified teachers. Okay, but if you look at the research, there is 0 correlation between having any credential and your effectiveness in the classroom. Okay, so why is that? A, it's because a bunch of these degrees are fake. Okay, so people are buying their certificates to take the exam. So unsurprising. But second is, even when the degree is real, if you do a content analysis of the curriculum, you'll see that most of the content of a teacher training program is history, theory, philosophy, sociology of education, rather than how do you manage a class, the practical aspects of pedagogy. Okay, so in all of these practical areas, the research shows that the best way for training is practice. It's not theory. Okay, so by interspersing theory and practice, it's also consistent with global evidence of how do you actually do better training. Okay, so that's the first. Second is you're augmenting state capacity in a fiscally feasible way. Okay, so today, when we think about why our learning outcomes are so poor, there are many reasons. Okay, but one of the biggest things that nobody talks about, okay, is the fact that because you have tried to build a school in every hamlet of the country, your average government school has about 30 to 40 students, and you have 1 or 2 teachers teaching 5 standards in a multi-grade setting. Okay, that the same teacher is teaching class 1, 2, 3 at the same time. Okay, now imagine that you have a couple of these kind of assistants who are part of the practical training. Then you can have the small group instruction, and this is exactly what happened to my own son's preschool in the US. Okay, when he was 4, his class was 25 kids, there was 1 teacher and 3 assistants, and so you have each group gets a group of 6 and you have the assistant. So you're able to do the small group instruction in a fiscally feasible way, right, while also improving the skills, because the stipend you'll pay during the practicum or apprenticeship is maybe 5,000 compared to a salary of 50,000, right? But that 5,000 is already better than the market, because people are in fact and I'll come back to another study, because everything I say is based on research, right? That's why there's 200 pages of references there. But the point is that even at that pay, people will want the job. Okay, so the first problem you're solving is you're solving the problem of better skilling and you're augmenting capacity. You're solving the judicial problem because this is not a permanent kind of thing of contract workers. It's a well-defined part of your training. Okay, and the political problem is solved. Why does the political problem build? It builds because you have years of contractual employees who are then that pressure cooker has no escape valve, and then before elections they come to say regularize me. Okay, but now what you're saying is we will do recruitment every year, but in that recruitment, we're just going to give points for people who have shown aptitude for that particular sector. Okay, so then you are improving the long-term pipeline of recruiting, you are improving the skilling, you're improving the match quality, and you're improving state capacity in a fiscally feasible way. Okay, so these are the but you see, it's not a silver bullet. It requires kind of thinking through the economics, the politics, the institutions, and then how do you come up with something that is, meets all of those criteria, right? So that's one example. And then of course, we can talk about more, but hopefully that gives you a good flavor of the kind of things that we need to do
absolutely.
to be able to attacking these issues.
Yes. And it sounded very much like the Agniveer scheme, right? And we know what that triggered. In terms of the protests, in terms of the politicization, this is exactly what that scheme is, that we train you for a while, and then in the final recruitment, those who do the best are taken into the army.
Correct.
And you end this with a corpus. Tell me what is wrong with this.
Correct.
Why was there such a big uproar?
Yeah, so to be completely honest, I think I am less convinced about Agniveer, the way it was done. Okay, and there are 2 or 3 reasons for that, right? I think the first is, and again, this is a balance, okay, but all I'm saying is that the core of my idea is meaningfully different from Agniveer, and I'll tell you why, right? See, the difference is that the military, right? The main job of the military is to apply lethal force, okay, and there is no civilian use case, okay, for applying lethal force, right? So I do worry a little bit, right? So in the Agniveer context, I think there are 2 or 3 substantive issues that I think require just a careful examination. Okay, the first is the fixed cost of training a fighting soldier, okay, is much higher. Just what you spend on the live rounds by the time somebody can safely fire a gun is large enough that the repay period for that is often quite longer, right? The second is the fact that if you look at the sociological research on kind of unit camaraderie and solidarity, they're in a situation where you're putting your life on the line. There may be a case for saying we need to at least assess what's happening. And then the third is because there is no civilian use case for that, correct? Whereas in this case, I feel much more confident, because whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's safety, the private sector is employing 4 times more. Okay, so what you're doing here is you're creating the skills and creating a pipeline of saying that you get points for the government job, but if you don't get the government job, there is a private sector that's 4x in terms of number of jobs, correct? And increasingly for health, that will also allow you to feed into a global labor market, where, because as the world is aging, this becomes a great opportunity for India, right? Where you say, let's actually provide the staffing, say for geriatric care in particular, right, around the world. And then you've got this skilling kind of ladder where you say, I'm constantly upgrading my skills. If I'm, if I'm good and I crack the government job, great. Otherwise, I have private sector jobs, and if I'm really good, then I can kind of even be competitive for global posting, right? So I think. So Agniveer, to be honest, I think now of course there's protests. Okay, now I think the protests will happen even for this reform. The protests happen because there are people who have spent their entire 20s writing these exams, like and feel that their dream is being taken away from them. Okay, so I think there is definitely an aspect of messaging, an aspect of how you do this, whereby you start with younger, newer cohorts, and it will require kind of careful consultation, messaging, etc. So I think the protest is one part, and then there's the question of the substance, right? And substance-wise, I think it'll probably be good to review Agniveer. I think that's going to happen, and these are some of the questions. I mean, again, there are strong benefits. I mean, the flip side for Agniveer is many armies have had kind of a conscript. There's an element that is, people come in and out. So this is, I'm not a professional soldier, so I have no idea, but that needs a review. But I feel more strongly about the applicability of this in these areas because this, like, again, private security employs 4 times as much as all the government security put together. Private healthcare, private education. So you're creating kind of supply for the market. And let me say something else about jobs, right? In a world of AI and automation, when everybody's asking where are the jobs going to come from, the future to jobs is going to be human intensive, human engagement intensive areas. And that's going to be, again, education, health, police. Those are the things you're not going to automate away. So the technology can increase the productivity of the human, but even from a job creation perspective, I think focusing on these service intensive areas, improving skilling and improving state capacity is, I think, going to be a win-win.
Yeah. And when I hear you say all these things, it sort of fits in because you constantly hear people saying there's unemployment in the country. Like private sector is not hiring enough. There are people are not getting jobs. I think people are not getting government jobs because every time I have met an entrepreneur, right from the street vendor, the chaat wala, he says, I don't get people to work. My contractor says, I don't get people to work. Factory owner with 5,000 workers says, log nahi milte hain. The biggest companies are saying, log nahi milte hain. We don't get the people. So I would imagine it's a wage and a skill problem. Rather than an unemployment problem in the country.
Exactly.
Would you agree with that?
Exactly, right? I mean, so I think there's a skill issue, there's a matching issue, and I think the elephant in the room that we have not reckoned with is the long shadow that the public sector labor market, kind of the overhang of that on the entire kind of human development and labor market, whether it's skilling, whether it's jobs, whether it's people. I mean, I have a PhD student who's working on exactly this issue, and kind of, I think she's in her pilots, looking at showing identical resumes to recruiters, right? Like, and actually finding that recruiters will automatically discount you a little bit if they see that you're applying for a government job because they know that you're not up. Picoge nahi, like, you'll keep going on and trying that exam again and again because wo lottery lag gayi to aapki life ban gayi, right? So, and that therefore we have to rethink, okay, like, the extent to which the structure of public sector labor markets is not only hurting governance and state capacity, but is casting this huge shadow on both skilling and kind of private sector job creation.
And is there political willingness to solve this? Because it is a political issue.
Yeah. See, I think the challenge is so many individual officers I have talked to, like, say, in fact, very senior people have said that this is perhaps the single most important idea in the book, right? The problem is that even for very senior people, it is not in the remit of just one person because you need sign-off from the line department, from higher and technical education, from GAD, from law, from finance, from planning. And just being able to coordinate folks and think in that level of systemic way sometimes doesn't happen because in government, your typical senior person has a tenure of 12 to 18 months, correct? So sometimes, again, the hope of a book like this is that it puts things together in a unified framework that can then kind of, create action. So the good news is I know there are people, in fact, multiple serving IAS officers who've written reviews of the book have flagged this idea as something that should be done. So the key is, again, one of the reasons I focus on state level reforms, right? And we'll talk about that if you have a chance. I mean, the main reason is that constitutionally, all of these issues are state government issues, right? Education, health, police, labor, land, they're all state, right? And states in India are bigger than most countries, okay? So we really need to be applying kind of a lot more intellectual and practical effort to state level innovation, right? So, but one of the things I'm optimistic about is that all you need is one state, right? You need to be willing to do something and then and the thing in bureaucracy is that everybody wants things, but the instinct is risk aversion, correct? So once you have a precedent, then it becomes much, much easier to move things. So that's kind of the hope here, right? I mean, is we put out a menu of ideas to kind of support different reformers in different parts who want to run with things. And some things are already happening. And my hope is this is also something that will happen soon.
So, which are the states, according to you, who are a little ahead in this desire for change? Because what we have is solutions which worked 50 years ago. Whatever worked in agriculture 50 years ago is not working now. Your example of an ambassador car, of course, you need to replace it. So, there was a set of solutions like the whole centralization argument. It's not working anymore because we have changed, technology has changed. Which of the state governments get it, and who do you think is going to actually implement this faster than the rest?
Yeah. So I think the good news here is that there are reformers in every state. Okay. So, and I think one of the things is, one of the great quotes I heard, it's there in the chapter on federalism. So Ashwin Mahesh in Bangalore, who's a great advocate of decentralization, he says the best way to solve India's many problems is to increase the number of problem solvers. Okay, so you really want to encourage a lot more people to kind of take the initiative and think. Okay, so the good news is nothing prevents anybody from doing it. Okay, the challenge comes back to the same bandwidth issue that everybody is kind of overwhelmed. So to go to your question about which states, see, I think there are some states, particularly, I think Telangana, Tamil Nadu are states that have had a history where the politicians empower kind of strong officials and give them stability of tenure, right? So the key to doing these things is a certain amount of empowerment and a certain amount of stability and a certain amount of protection from honest mistakes, okay? Because in the end, it's the politician, because again, going back to what I said, in any org, any decision maker, we will never get everything right. So if you built a bureaucratic culture where you can be penalized for any mistake, then you've just paralyzed the system, okay? So you need political leadership to say, "Mere ko ye karna hai," and you empower the officers to figure things out, and then you create that culture whereby there is both initiative and course correction and application. Now, the good news though is, as I travel around the country and meet, in every state, there are people. So I think, recently Odisha, Maharashtra, UP, so there are reformers and in every state. Okay, so I think it's less about a particular state and it's more about every state waking up to its own power. Okay, so one way to say this is that what has happened because of the over centralization is that the states have actually lost their policy making muscles. Okay, and some of this comes from the centrally sponsored schemes, which and again, it had a good logic. It had a good logic of saying that because there was so much disparity in education, health, etc., in the early 2000s, at that period, Government of India felt that nothing will move unless we come in and design schemes and put some resources. And so that was necessary, right? Again, so just like certain agriculture policies were needed in the 60s, but are now counterproductive, you needed a certain amount of central push, okay, for getting certain infrastructure, certain investments, certain things done. But the downside of that is because everything then has to follow those guidelines, that the states, in many cases, like for a secretary who wants to do something, it is so much easier to propose something that is in a central guideline where there is money already there, as opposed to doing the work of applying their mind for designing a program, going to their finance department, getting the approval, getting the political approval. These things take time, and the average tenure of an officer is 18 months. Okay, so that's why, right? I mean, it starts with kind of political willingness to invest in governance, recognizing that the key to that is kind of identifying and empowering the officials with a certain amount of runway to say we got to solve these problems, and then giving them the support where needed, right? So the good news, and so recently, for example, state like Meghalaya, which nobody knows, or focuses, but Meghalaya has had some incredible work, on governance reforms and state capacity, right? Assam is doing some interesting things. So the reform pockets are there everywhere, right? So that's why by working at the state level, I'm deeply convinced that this is how we accelerate national progress. Because if you wait, see, the other problem of trying to do everything from Delhi is that the diversity of the country is too big, right? So, and what is optimal is going to vary in different places. So if I try to do something standardized, you will not be able to get the buy-in, and rightly so, because it will often not make sense for everybody, right? So given the diversity, the center's role becomes often to kind of play a catalyst, right? So you can have, so the way I would move a lot of reforms is because center would say, "Arey, state should do this." State will say, "Arey, why is the center not doing it?" Right? So one way to do this is for the center to apply its mind with regard to certain frameworks and templates, and then kind of encourage states, right? I mean, saying, okay, so it's a very subtle change, right? So what happens in government, and not just it's in every government, right? So when you rise up the chain, you always want more power. It's very difficult to let go, okay? But you kind of have, the more senior you get, just like a good CEO CEO is not a micromanager. A good CEO enables his or her direct reports, correct? So similarly, the government of India in every department has to think of its role not as a doer, but as an enabler and an accelerator, right? So you enable and accelerate with policy frameworks, with funding, with a certain amount of maybe performance-based funding, right? So put a little bit of incentives and reforms, and then you keep on convening and supporting states, right? Where you need political alignment, you focus maybe on the states that are governed by the same party and saying, chalo, we believe in this. Kam se kam hamare state mein karke dekhte hain hota hai nahi, right? Like, and so it requires, see, again, going back to centralization, the population of India is like staggering, right? We have more people than the entire Western Hemisphere put together, right? More than North America, Central America, South America. You don't have a government of the Western Hemisphere that is trying to do like, education and health, right? So what you do at a national level are the functions that benefit from economies of scale. So you do defense, you do foreign policy, you do currency, you do like, trade agreements, right? So those are the things that you need the economies of scale for. You can't just let them on their own. So you need to both be kind of watchful, but contribute to that, right? So how as a citizen do you contribute as opposed to just the same? And I think there are lots of ideas, lots of ways for people to get engaged. And some of the things I've been most gratified about in the past year, like, since the book, is the number of cases where civil society orgs, students and others, like, are taking ideas and running with it by themselves. And I think that's what gives me, that gives me the greatest joy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. I do these conversations so that you can make up your own mind about the India story. Different experts will give you different viewpoints. It's up to you to connect the dots. Do tell me who you'd like me to invite next. Drop a comment below.
Investment in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing. Please read the risk disclosure documents carefully before investing in equity shares, derivatives, mutual fund, and or other instruments traded on the stock exchanges.